Now we are learning more about why the Rolling Stones canceled their tour, which includes a stop right here in New Orleans at Jazz Fest.
Yeah, Mick Jagger will undergo surgery to replace a valve in his heart. That's according to RollingStones.com.
Mick Jagger has spent more than 60 years being one of the most watched, most written about, and most analyzed figures in the history of popular music. He has given thousands of interviews, performed for hundreds of millions of people, and built a public persona so precisely constructed that most journalists stopped trying to get past it decades ago. But there are things he has circled for years without ever quite landing on directly. Things that people close to him have referenced, that his own actions have implied, and that fans have suspected for a very long time. Recently, in Fragments, and with his characteristic indirectness, he has finally started confirming some of them, and the picture that emerges is more complicated than the legend. The relationship that defined and nearly destroyed everything. If you want to understand Mick Jagger, the actual person rather than the performance, the most important place to start is not his childhood or his vocal style or his extraordinary physical stamina on stage. It is his relationship with Keith Richards. Because that partnership, which has now lasted more than 60 years, is the central fact of his professional life, the source of his greatest creative achievements, and the thing he has been most carefully indirect about in public for most of that time. They met as children, lost touch, and reconnected as teenagers on a train platform in Dartford in 1961, when Richards noticed Jagger was carrying American rhythm and blues records that were almost impossible to find in England at the time. That shared obsession became the foundation of everything. Within a short period, they were playing music together, living in the same chaotic flat in Chelsea, and beginning to write songs in a collaboration that would eventually produce one of the most significant catalogs in rock history. What Jagger has confirmed in recent years, and with more directness than he once allowed himself, is that the relationship with Richards has also been one of the most genuinely difficult of his life. Not difficult in the way that gets softened into creative tension for magazine profiles, but difficult in the specific and exhausting way that comes from being bound to someone whose self-destructive capacity is significant and whose relationship with accountability is, to put it generously, complicated. Richards's substance addiction, which was severe and prolonged across the 1970s, is the most documented element of this. Jagger has spoken about it with increasing candor in recent years, describing the experience of working alongside someone in the grip of serious addiction as something that affected everyone around Richards, without anyone having any real power to change it. He has described the creative sessions of that period as moving at a completely different pace. With everything slowed and complicated, he has acknowledged that he does not fully know what Richards experienced internally during those years because the two of them, for all their closeness, did not talk about it directly. That last detail is the one that opens something up about who Jagger actually is. Here is a man who has spent 6 decades in one of the most intimate professional relationships possible, and his honest answer to questions about what his partner was going through is that he genuinely does not know, because they did not have that conversation. That is not a failure of the relationship. It is a description of how Jagger operates: present, observant, deeply invested in the work, and simultaneously maintaining a distance from emotional directness that he has never fully closed. What Jagger has confirmed more recently is that there is also a specific source of tension with Richards that goes beyond the addiction years, one that has to do with the fundamental question of who controls the Rolling Stones and what the band actually is. Richards has always positioned himself as the keeper of the band's musical soul.
He is a rock and roll legend and, of course, a Connecticut resident. Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards being honored with the first ever Governor's Award of Excellence.
The one who holds the line against commercialization and compromise. Jagger has increasingly been the one who manages the business, the touring operation, the commercial relationships, and the strategic decisions that keep an enterprise of that scale functioning. Richards has criticized Jagger publicly for this, at various points with considerable sharpness, including remarks that were pointed enough to raise genuine questions about whether the band could continue. Jagger's response to those criticisms has been characteristically controlled, but what he has confirmed, more clearly than before, is that he has made peace with the fact that he and Richards see the Rolling Stones differently, and that this difference is permanent rather than something that will ever be fully resolved. What Altamont actually did to him. There are moments that define public figures in ways they have no control over, and for Mick Jagger, the concert at Altamont Speedway in December of 1969 is that moment. It has been written about, filmed, analyzed, and mythologized to the point where the actual human experience of the people involved has been almost entirely subsumed by the narrative the event generated. What Jagger has confirmed in the years since is that the gap between how Altamont has been culturally processed and what it actually felt like from where he was standing is enormous. The basic facts are documented. The Rolling Stones organized a free concert in Northern California that was announced only days in advance, planned inadequately, and secured by members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club in an arrangement that almost immediately produced violence. By the end of the day, 4 people were dead. Among them was an 18-year-old named Meredith Hunter, who was stabbed in circumstances that were captured on film and later included in the documentary Gimme Shelter. The cultural shorthand that developed around Altamont positioned it as the end of the 1960s, the moment when the idealism of that decade collapsed into its own contradictions. Jagger has consistently pushed back against that framing, not to minimize what happened, but because it converts a specific and devastating event into a symbolic abstraction in a way that he has found inadequate and, in some ways, dishonest. What he has confirmed is that his response to Altamont was immediate, personal, and had nothing to do with what it represented culturally. It was about the specific fact that a young man had been killed at an event he had organized, and that people had been affected by the tragedy, and that the sense of shock and sadness from that was not something that lifted quickly or translated into larger philosophical conclusions. He has also confirmed something about the aftermath that received considerably less attention than the event itself. According to accounts that emerged later, members of the Hells Angels, angered by Jagger's public condemnation of their behavior at Altamont, allegedly plotted to target him at his home in the Hamptons. The plan, according to former FBI agent accounts that surfaced in a documentary, involved approaching the property by water to avoid his security. The group reportedly set out by boat and were driven back by a storm before reaching their destination. Jagger has confirmed that he was not informed of this alleged plot at the time it occurred, and processed the information about it only much later. What that detail adds to the Altamont story is significant. Here is a man who publicly criticized a dangerous organization, apparently not knowing that the act of doing so had generated a direct threat against him that he was never warned about. His security, or the authorities, or someone in that chain made the decision that he did not need to know. He found out later, from reporting rather than from anyone who had a direct obligation to tell him. Jagger has not dwelt on this publicly in dramatic terms, but when he has addressed it, what comes through is a specific kind of reckoning. The recognition that his public position, his visibility, and his willingness to speak plainly about things he witnessed had consequences that operated entirely outside his awareness for years. It is the kind of thing that changes how a person thinks about what they say and who can hear it. And it is consistent with a broader pattern in Jagger's approach to public life that becomes clearer the more carefully you look at it. The city that shaped him and the country that disturbed him. Mick Jagger was born in Dartford, Kent, in 1943, during wartime. His father was a physical education teacher, his mother a hairdresser, and the household he grew up in was, by his own description, ordinary in almost every respect. What distinguished it was not wealth or bohemian creativity, but a kind of self-sufficient family culture, built partly out of necessity in a period when entertainment had to be generated within the home because external options were limited. People performed for each other. Children were expected to contribute. Jagger has described this as the origin of something he recognizes in himself: the instinct to perform, to get a reaction, to hold a room. By his early teens, he was sneaking out to watch local bands and absorbing everything he could about American rhythm and blues, which was reaching England in limited quantities through imported records and the occasional broadcast. The music represented something specific to him, a kind of freedom and physicality that English culture of that period did not easily accommodate. When he connected with Richards over their shared obsession with those records, the foundation being laid was not just musical, but aspirational. They were both reaching towards something that felt genuinely elsewhere. When the Rolling Stones eventually got to America, in 1964, the reality of the country hit Jagger with considerable force. He has spoken about New York with genuine warmth and Los Angeles with moderate interest. But what he has confirmed about the rest of the country is far less flattering. He described the America of 1964 as one of the most repressive societies he had encountered, with racial segregation still openly operational in significant parts of the country, and attitudes that struck him as belonging to a previous era. That observation is worth sitting with in context. Here was a 20-year-old from Kent describing his first encounter with the country that had produced the music he had built his entire identity around. And what he found was that the society that generated that music was simultaneously brutalizing the people who created it. The rhythm and blues records he and Richards had been collecting were products of a culture operating under conditions that bore no resemblance to the romantic idea of American freedom. Those records had seemed to represent from a distance. Jagger has confirmed that this experience shaped how he understood the relationship between art and the conditions that produce it, and between aspiration and reality, in ways that stayed with him. He went on to succeed in America on a significant scale, and he has never pretended that the commercial reality of that success was in tension with his early impressions. He simply held both things at the same time, which is consistent with how he has operated across most of his career. Clear-eyed about the contradictions, unwilling to resolve them artificially, and quietly more thoughtful about what he has witnessed than the performance suggests. The songs and what he has finally admitted about them. The Rolling Stones' songwriting catalog is one of the most analyzed bodies of work in popular music, and Mick Jagger's role in producing it has generated decades of critical and biographical attention. What Jagger himself has said about where those songs came from has always been notably and sometimes frustratingly honest, in the sense that his answers tend to deflate the mythology rather than contribute to it. His account of writing Satisfaction, the song that announced the Stones as a genuinely global force in 1965, is one of the more interesting examples of this. He has described it as emerging in an ordinary moment, sitting by a pool in Florida while the band was on tour. The riff, the structure, the particular energy of the song did not arrive through any process that maps onto the romantic idea of artistic inspiration. It arrived the way most things arrive when someone is working constantly, through proximity to the work rather than through a specific creative breakthrough. This is a pattern in what Jagger has confirmed about the songwriting process generally. He and Richards were extraordinarily productive during their early touring years because the conditions of touring, the enforced proximity, the absence of other demands, the constant exposure to audiences and their responses created an environment where writing was simply what you did with the time available. He has described writing approximately 12 songs in 2 weeks during certain tour legs, which is a rate that reflects craft and habit rather than inspiration. The song As Tears Go By, one of his earliest compositions, was written not for the Stones but as a writing exercise and ended up recorded by Marianne Faithfull before the band played it themselves. Jagger has confirmed that many of the early songs were not composed from deep personal experience, but from imagination, from observation, and from the particular freedom of writing before the stakes became high enough to generate self-consciousness. Brown Sugar, one of the most controversial songs in the catalog, is a case where Jagger's honesty about his own process becomes genuinely interesting. He has acknowledged that he does not fully know what was driving him when he wrote it, that the specific combination of imagery and energy in the song came from somewhere he cannot entirely account for, and that retrospective analysis of its content is something he finds genuinely complicated. He has also confirmed that the band stopped performing the song live, a decision that reflects his capacity to hold his own past work critically without pretending the complexity does not exist. What Jagger has been more willing to confirm in recent years is that the songs he is proudest of are not necessarily the ones the public has decided are definitive. He has spoken about the Stones' work in the early 1970s, particularly the material from Exile on Main Street, as representing something the band arrived at through a combination of circumstances that could not have been engineered deliberately. The chaos of recording in Richards's villa in the south of France, the financial and legal pressures the band was operating under, and the particular chemistry of that specific period produced music that he considers genuinely irreplaceable, and whose origins were so accidental that he has confirmed he is not entirely sure how it happened. Brian Jones, Keith Richards, and The Thing, Jagger finally said out loud. Two relationships in Mick Jagger's life shaped him more than any others, and both involved the same painful experience, watching someone he cared about spiral beyond control while remaining tied to them personally and professionally. The first was Brian Jones, the founding member of the Rolling Stones. Jones assembled the original lineup, named the band, and helped define its early sound. But as the group became famous, his substance and alcohol use worsened, making his role increasingly unstable. By 1969, the band decided to remove him from the group he had created. Jagger has since spoken candidly about that period. He admitted Jones became a target within the band, and said their treatment of him sometimes crossed into cruelty. Jagger blamed part of it on youth and the social dynamics of young men reacting to someone vulnerable in their circle. He later described his own behavior as childish and acknowledged that Jones's instability made it easier for others to mistreat him. Jones died in July 1969 after being found at the bottom of his swimming pool in East Sussex. He was 27 years old. The official ruling was drowning, with substances and alcohol listed as contributing factors. Although theories about his death have persisted for decades, Jagger has never encouraged them. What he has confirmed is that Jones was deeply troubled by the end, disconnected from the band creatively, and no longer capable of continuing with the Stones. Jagger has said the recording of No Expectations during the Beggars Banquet sessions in 1968 was the last time he felt Jones was fully engaged in the band's music. That memory carries weight because it shows Jones's decline was not sudden. It was a slow unraveling that the entire band witnessed over several painful years. Even after his departure, Jones remained central to the band's history because his influence shaped the Stones long before their greatest success. Jagger's reflections reveal not only regret, but also recognition that fame, pressure, and immaturity intensified problems inside the group. His comments about Jones stand out because they avoid mythology. Instead, they describe a talented but troubled musician whose collapse unfolded painfully in front of the people who depended on him most. The second relationship is Richards, which loops back to where this story began, but arrives there differently, having traced what Jagger has confirmed about Jones. Because the pattern is visible once you look at both simultaneously, Jagger has spent much of his career bound to talented, self-destructive people whose capacity for damage extended to those around them, managing those relationships without being able to fully protect himself from their costs, and processing the experience in public only years or decades after the fact. What he has confirmed most clearly in recent years is that the Rolling Stones, the institution, the ongoing concern, the thing that continues to exist and tour and release music, has required from him a particular kind of endurance that goes beyond physical stamina. It has required him to absorb losses, manage crises, navigate the gap between what the band represents publicly and what it has demanded privately, and keep moving forward in circumstances that would have ended most organizations several times over. The knighthood he received in 2003, which Richards publicly and pointedly criticized, is in some ways a perfect symbol of this dynamic. Jagger accepted an honor that acknowledged his contribution to British culture. Richards dismissed it. Both responses are entirely consistent with who each of them is. And Jagger, as he has confirmed, has simply made peace with the fact that consistency from Richards on questions like this was never something he was going to receive. What he has built across all of it is something that outlasts the contradictions without resolving them. That is the confirmation that matters most. If Mick Jagger spent 60 years carefully managing the distance between his public persona and what he was actually experiencing, does the fact that he is finally closing that distance say more about who he has become or about what he no longer feels he needs to protect? And if the Rolling Stones survived Brian Jones, survived the addiction years, survived Altamont, and survived everything Richards said about Jagger in public, what exactly would it take to end something that has already outlasted every reasonable prediction of how long it could last? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.